Welcome back to another YouTube video, and today I've got a quick one on the Minimalist Wedge Deadlift setup. And this is kind of a continuation or kind of a spin-off of the three-step deadlift setup video I did, and it's coming from Brad Couillard. I actually had a call with him recently, kind of discussing some things deadlift technique-wise, and he had mentioned this cueing, and it really just kind of hit me of exactly how this could be applied in a really good way for a more minimalist approach in a way I hadn't heard before. And Brad gave me permission to be able to do a video on this, so I want to thank him for that. So within that, I'm obviously going to show you what Brad taught me, as well as give my spin on kind of how I look at this in application and who I'm going to be using this with and how I'm going to be actually coaching it. So before getting into the actual setup and cueing of it, I want to kind of give an idea of why would we even want a minimalist deadlift approach, meaning like very little movement. You're not having this big sway of the hips coming to the bar, just very minimal movement. And the reason comes back to a lot of the things that I said in my video of how to stop over wedging on the deadlift. And I mentioned in that video, the more room we have to move when we wedge, the harder it's going to be to stop in this pinpoint location where our center of mass is. Now, obviously we can deviate somewhat from our center of mass and we're fine, but we're trying to replicate that rep after rep after rep. And the farther we travel, the more possibility we tend to have for error of stopping on a very specific location, where if we can minimalize that, we can be able to have a way to possibly be more consistent in finding that exact spot time after time. And so when we're wedging, there's two things that are happening that kind of have to align themselves perfectly to manage that center of mass where we need it to be. And that's in some way the shoulders translating back over the bar, and in some way the hips translating towards the bar to meet and basically stack to align that center of mass. And the two common things we see when wedging, and this approach of trying to create this like fulcrum and rotation of the shoulders and hips aligning, is one, we often see people get too far over the bar, and then as they wedge, their whole body comes forward towards where their shoulders are, and creates that forward shift and that over wedging. Or the opposite, some people, when they set up, the shoulders are over the bar, and then they don't have any translation of the hips, the shoulders just come back, they get too far back on their heels, and now their center of mass is overly shifted back. So we need this correct combination of translation of the shoulders and translation of the hips to align. And again, the more room we move, the likely more chance we have for error. And so that's where this minimalist setup approach can come in. The second reason we might be implementing this more minimalist approach is the fact that sometimes people don't do great with cueing slack pull, and kind of we'll call it the normal approach of you're setting up, you pull slack, and then you wedge in. People tend to do one of two things sometimes that run into issues. One, they over pull slack and end up pulling it out of their body and kind of like to overly emphasize the slack pull when it shouldn't be as aggressive. And the second thing people do is if you're out of position in that normal setup, if I slack pull from here, my shoulders are way out over the bar. You can see the bar rolls to where my shoulders are. And so sometimes that initial slack pull before the wedge gets us into trouble. And as I'm going to show with this minimalist approach, we really don't cue slack pull until we wedge. It's one progressive movement where as we start that minimalist wedge, the slack pull progressively increases as part of that process. So with that stated, of the potential issues that we see with the general wedge and slack pull process and where a minimalist approach might help to fix that type of solution, let's get into the cueing. So as mentioned, this is kind of like a spin-off of my three-step deadlift setup. So you're going to see some similarities, but there's going to be one distinct difference of how we're going to change the cueing to create this minimalist approach. As well as, if you haven't watched Sean Noriega's video on Powerlifting Now and his full deadlift tutorial, a lot of this stuff he really touches on and really kind of goes over. I mean, that's a much more extensive video. Definitely recommend watching that if you want an entire breakdown of all the different little steps. But this is more going to be just the simple deadlift setup and something hopefully you can just take immediately and be able to implement. So getting into sumo first, I'd likely say this setup style lends itself to sumo more than conventional, although we can apply it to both, and I'm going to get to conventional in a second. But with sumo, it tends to really help because that's where I often find people tend to have more of an over wedging issue. But how you go through this process, and really it's a three-step process just like my other setup tutorial, is first, we're going to be in position, and you're going to lead with letting those knees drive out. Same exact first step. And you can see as I do that, there tends to be a natural hinge. I'm not going to stay upright because that's going to get me way too far back. It's going to get me oddly back on my heels. If I'm just letting those kind of knees drive out to the bar to where my toes are, I'm naturally going to have a little bit of a hinge, and you can see my arms are hanging directly over the bar. Now here's where the cueing from the 3-step deadlift setup changes. What I'm gonna really think about is very loose arms, no tension, just letting them relax. And I'm going to think about my hands gravitating and pulling towards the midline of my heel, not down to the bar, but down towards the midline of my heel. And you can see as I do that, my shoulders translate forward over the bar and my hips translates back. The one slight difference from if you're not using a minimalist approach is often we're gonna bias a little bit more of a hinge to keep those arms and shoulders over the bar. With this approach, we're actually gonna allow the shoulders to come forward, but also make sure we're doing so in a way the hips translate back. And the key there is to think about those loose hands translating back towards the heels. Because if they just translate straight down, we're gonna get too far over and we're probably going to overly wedge forward. So knees out, arms loose, hands translate back, which creates an even distribution of shoulders forward over the bar and hips translating back. And so once we're within reach of the bar, that's where we're gonna grab it. Because we're obviously not gonna let those hands continually pull all the way towards the heels. That's not gonna accomplish our task. We need to eventually grab the bar. So we're gonna let those knees drive out. We're gonna have those hands gravitate towards the midline of the heel. And then once we're within reach of the bar, we're gonna grab it. And you can see in this position, those shoulders are gonna be slightly forward of the bar, but also we have that hip translation back. And our goal now is to create that rotational effect of the shoulders translating back, the hips coming forward, and finding that center of mass right over our midfoot. So knees out, hands gravitate. I can grab the bar, and then from here, shoulders translate back, hips translate forward, and you can see it's a very, very minimal wedge. And it also tends to really force and create patience. You really can't go into the setup and be jerky because you don't have very much room to move. If you try and move fast, you're gonna hit that bar and get out of position. So it really promotes the fact that as I pull those hands towards the heels, I grab the bar and very minimal approach. It's going to promote really extreme patience as I wedge in because we're not using that like strong, rapid wedge in to creating momentum. We're really relying on consistent and strong positioning to do so. And then lastly, you could probably see as I was doing this, I really was never overly cueing slack pull. It was just part of the process. So those knees drive out, those hands translate towards the hips. I grab the bar, and as I grab the bar, there's a little bit of tension just because I'm trying not to be too low. And then from there, as the shoulders translate back and kind of up and the hips translate forward, it's very gradual that slack starts to pull. And then I have a lot of tension right in this position. I can even hold that tension before then lifting. So next up, let's take a look at how this applies to conventional. It will be slightly different because if you remember my 3-step deadlift setup, conventional is slightly different from sumo there too. And it really comes down to the fact that with conventional, we're going to have more of a hinge bias. We can't get away from it. It's more of a hinge-based movement. And we're not usually gonna start with those knees driving forward or bending too much. We're gonna start with that hinge. So what we're going to do on the conventional is from this get-go, whether you're bracing or not at this point, we have those arms loose. We maybe have a little slight bend in our knee just to kind of make sure that shin more kind of maintains that vertical translation versus going back forward or going back too much. And then from there, same thing. We can hinge and think about as I hinge, those hands pull towards my heel. And I have that movement, they pull towards my heel at the last second. I go to grab the bar, and then from here, those shoulders are slightly forward, the hips have slightly translated back. Again, I'm trying not to overly translate the hips back in this style, so I can have a more minimalist wedge. And so then as I grab the bar, same thing as with sumo, it's a progressive slack pull. Arms loose, I'm going to let those hands translate towards my heels. I'm going to grab the bar, and then as I do that, I'm gonna let those shoulders translate back, the hips translate forward, and then progressively slack pull. So that concludes the video and the setup of how to do a more minimalist wedge approach. So I hope you got something from that. And as always, this isn't gonna apply to everyone. I put a lot of these videos out with some different setup styles because you can take what possibly is gonna work best for you, give it a shot. And then to finish this off, the thing that's very important for sumo and conventional with this minimalist style that might be different from some other some wedging techniques is we need to maintain our midfoot the entirety of the time. I've had a post in the past where I talked about like heel to midfoot can be a good cue. For this setup style, you've got to continually maintain your midfoot position. And honestly, a cue that could be very good to apply in the same setup is a video that Marcellus Williams did on maintaining big toe contact. You can watch that if you want more information there. But what I mean is if we do this setup, and And then as we let those hands gravitate towards the heels, if we shift on the heels, it's gonna shift our shoulders back over the bar, and then we're gonna get into the same issues we already have. We're gonna be too far behind or whatever it may be. So we really need to maintain that midfoot pressure so that as those hands gravitate forwards, those shoulders translate forward. Because if we don't, if we get up too far back onto our heels, that we're not going to actually have that occur. So it's very, very, very important, if you need to, feel a little big toe pressure, that as you go through the setup, you maintain that midfoot position, and all you're doing is maintaining that the whole time and then driving into that spot as you go through that minimalist wedge. And see what setup style is going to work best for you. In the grand scheme of things, this more minimalist approach, like I said, it could work for conventional or sumo, but I probably bias a bit more towards sumo pullers, and where this can really help to be able to increase patience, increase consistency with that initial positioning for people who are really, really sensitive with those center of mass deviations and need something where they're not going to overly rely on that like explosive wedge, but more just rely on that consistent positioning and maintaining that center of mass. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below and I'll make sure to answer those. Give the video a like, subscribe, share if you feel like some other people will benefit. Until next time, peace.